Thank you, Russell. Good morning, everybody. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we're meeting and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the sea country throughout the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, and also to thank Gavin and Guju for the welcome to country before. So, we've said for at least 15 years now that the major threats to the Great Barrier Reef are climate change, poor water quality, coastal development, and impacts from some forms of fishing, particularly illegal fishing. But the events of the last few years have made it very clear that the impacts from climate change are by far the greatest threats to the reef out of those four sets of impacts. And although there are many potential sources of threats to the reef from climate change, it's those top three that we've seen particularly playing out over the last few years. When we actually look at the series of extreme weather events that we've had since 1998, which was our first major bleaching event, we see a very impressive list of extreme weather. Record-breaking floods, 10 severe category cyclones, and a series of marine heat waves. Now, we can't point to every individual weather event on that list and say that's climate change, but certainly that overall picture of growing frequency and severity of events is exactly what is predicted with climate change, and in particular, the heat waves that caused the bleaching in 2016 and 2017 are essentially almost impossible without the impacts of anthropogenic climate change. So just looking at some of the specific impacts that we've seen, there's been obviously a lot of global attention on the reef for the last 2 years because of the bleaching, but something that slipped by almost unnoticed was a series of record-breaking floods in the years from 2009 to 2012. I actually lost count of how many times we were told we just had a 1 in 100 year flood. Anyone would think that the climate was changing. That series of floods over 4 years led to very high amounts of turbidity in inshore waters, and coupled with cyclonic activity led to very strong declines in most of our richest seagrass communities. And as a consequence, in 2011 and 2012, we saw by far the highest numbers of stranded dugong and green turtle, which rely predominantly on seagrass for their food. And these animals were all emaciated, and we broke all previous records of stranded dead animals by a very long way. So, although those events passed without too much fanfare and certainly did not get the global media attention of recent bleaching, they just illustrate the breadth of impacts to the Great Barrier Reef from climate events, and the importance of thinking about groups of plants and animals and habitats other than just corals and coral reefs. So there's a great session later in the conference about some of the other restoration activities that are being considered beyond corals and coral reefs. Obviously, the thing that's grabbed the headlines in the last 2 years is the coral bleaching driven by 2 extreme marine heat waves. These are the results of aerial surveys led by Terry Hughes at the Australian Centre of Excellence in Coral Reef Studies, and precisely matching the pattern of thermal anomaly. The bleaching was by far the worst in the northern third of the Great Barrier Reef in 2016 and the central third of the reef in 2017. Now, we don't have really precise figures for the mortality in 2017, but certainly in 2016 what we saw was, although there was it was a reef-wide event, the mortality was very much spatially constrained to the north with a little bit in the central. Now, looking at the pattern of the severity of the bleaching, we know that there would have been much more mortality in 2017 in the central part of the reef. And just to emphasise fairly obviously, the Great Barrier Reef is a favourite topic for the global media, but it's not the only reef system by any means that is being impacted by climate change. So NOAA very effectively reported on a global coral bleaching event that ran from 2014 to 2017 and was the worst that we've ever seen. So perhaps the Great Barrier Reef is a poster child for the impacts of climate change on coral reefs, but it is certainly not on its own. Just looking at the impact of the cyclones, and a couple of the earlier speakers mentioned the size of the Great Barrier Reef, so that red line goes around the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. It is bigger than 2/3 of the countries on Earth, yet climate change is rendering that size much less of a defence against impacts than it once was. So if we look at the sequence of cyclones, starting in 2005, we had 10 of them until last year. These are just the severe category cyclones that I'm putting up, not all cyclones, and obviously it's the severe category 3, 4 and 5 cyclones that do the worst damage, culminating with Cyclone Debbie in 2017. So notwithstanding that this marine park is bigger than 2/3 of the countries on Earth, it has been carpeted by severe cyclones since 2005. Now these are data from the Australian Institute of Marine Science, who conduct the long-term monitoring program on the Great Barrier Reef. It's been going since the mid-1980s. The graphs depict coral cover, average coral cover in the northern, central and southern regions. And we can see three really important things. One is that in recent times we've seen bigger impacts than we've seen in the past, driven by extreme weather events such as bleaching and cyclones. We can see that at the moment all three of those regions are in decline in terms of coral cover, and that's the first time we've ever seen that since the monitoring began. But then the third and perhaps the most important thing about those graphs is that every time we've seen an impact, we've also seen the Great Barrier Reef demonstrate its resilience and begin to bounce back. That is why this is the time to begin thinking about restoration. I'll talk in a moment about what we know climate change is going to bring. But the point is we need to be planning now while the reef is still resilient, so that we are protecting that resilience, not trying to resurrect a dead ecosystem in 20 or 30 years' time. So regrettably, with those coral cover statistics and the impacts of the extreme weather that we've seen, more and more of the Great Barrier Reef does look something like this. This is cyclone damage. Bleaching damage looks similarly grim, though not quite as smashed up. But nonetheless, the Great Barrier Reef is very large, it is very diverse. Those weather events have not impacted everywhere equally. Much of the Great Barrier Reef still looks like this. And of course, these are the areas that we need to focus on for protection, because these are the areas that will start the recovery of the next generation of corals and the regeneration of the system. These are also the areas that underpin the social and economic values that people have for the reef. And so increasingly, for ecological and social and economic reasons, these are the areas that are becoming increasingly important. And I really do want to emphasise, it's already been mentioned that the Great Barrier Reef isn't dead. The international media have reported that it is with great glee. That's not only not true, it's actually quite irresponsible and quite damaging. I spend most of my professional life advocating to people that we need to work harder to protect the Great Barrier Reef. Trying to convince people to work harder to protect something that they think is dead is very difficult. The Great Barrier Reef is very much alive. It's doing everything it can to adapt and fight and survive and maintain its resilience, but it is also still a critical part of the Australian national psyche, the national identity of Australians. As we heard Guja and Gavin talk about, it is a central part of the traditional culture and spirituality of Australians' First Nations people, the Aborigine and Torres Strait Islander people. It is a global icon. It's one of the identified 7 natural wonders of the world, and in 1981 it was inscribed on the World Heritage List. Let's be frank, it's worth an awful lot of money. It's worth billions of dollars in direct economic activity. It is worth tens of billions of dollars in ecosystem goods and services, and it supports tens of thousands of jobs. Last but certainly not least, it is also the inspiration for Finding Nemo, and for many younger people to whom I speak, that's actually the thing where they go, oh, that's the Great Barrier Reef. So let's not forget that too. So a critical thing about the growing impacts of climate change to the reef is what are the social and economic consequences of that. These are annual tourism visitation figures to the marine park going back to 1994, and at least so far we don't see a clear signal of the bleaching events, but of course people book their holidays well in advance, and this is a critical statistic that we have to keep our eyes on in order to see how both the real condition of the Great Barrier Reef, and perhaps even more importantly, the perceived condition of the Great Barrier Reef, are affecting visitation. And of course, this is the biggest economic driver in terms of money and jobs that the Great Barrier Reef provides. So this subtle slide is to remind me to point out that the floods, the heat waves, the cyclones that I have talked about, which are all pretty confronting and pretty terrible and challenging for a reef manager to know what to do about, have all happened in a world that is about 1 degree warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution. Doesn't sound like much, but it's made a big difference to the weather on our planet. That's an important number because when we look to the future and we look at the representative concentration pathways that represent the different options humanity might follow in terms of future greenhouse gas emissions and future climate change, even if we look not that far into the future to the year 2050, which is the end horizon of the Reef 2050 plan, we see a very significant difference in the temperature that we will have on this planet by 2050. And if we follow the worst of those possible trajectories, we're looking at being plus 2.3 degrees warmer. If we follow the best of those trajectories, we're still looking at being plus 1.4, and I've had to adjust the scale on the y-axis because that's against an end of 20th century baseline, not a pre-industrial. So I've changed those numbers to be pre-industrial. I think the scientific evidence is pretty clear. If we're at plus 2.3 by the year 2050, we will not be able to protect the resilience of our coral reefs. We will not be able to continue to derive the social, cultural, economic benefits from coral reefs that we do today. But at plus 1.4, we've got a fighting chance. And the science is increasingly telling us that if we get the local management right, 1.4 could be manageable. But what this says is, this is the time to start the conversation about interventions and restorations, because we can see already in the weather of today, at plus 1 degree, that we are facing very serious challenges. Hopefully I will be retired by the year 2050, but even at plus 1.4, my successors are going to be dealing with some really serious challenges. And so the subject of this conference is critical now, because we need to start the science now to have the tools in place by 2030, 2040, even if we do a great job of mitigating greenhouse gas emissions. And of course, it's what we do today that will determine where we sit in terms of global temperature by 2050. So that's the global picture, but we need to focus on what we're doing locally. And I just want to give a bit of a broader context to sit the discussions at this conference about restoration and intervention into. So in terms of looking at local management of local problems, we have got three major avenues of activity. The first is a joint state-federal plan to work on improving land management to reduce pollution to the reef and improve reef water quality. The second is a Queensland state government initiative to have a 10-year program to improve fisheries management and the sustainability of our fisheries. And that plan has a focus on the future of climate change and what that means for management of fisheries. Of course, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Zoning Plan is critical to providing the foundation of protection of our biodiversity and the resilience of the system. We've known for a long time that no-take areas have larger numbers and bigger of targeted species of fish, but there's emerging evidence that those green zones also are more resilient and have faster recovery rates after disturbances like cyclones and bleaching events. And as Patrick mentioned, those three strategies and many other smaller ones are wrapped up into an integrated plan called the Reef 2050 Long-Term Sustainability Plan. That is the bringing together of state, federal, local government, with industry, with partners, into the collective, what are we doing to protect the Great Barrier Reef locally? Despite the existence of the 2050 plan and its subcomponents, after the two bleaching events in 2016 and 2017, we at Gibraltar sat down and said we really need to have a long, hard look at ourselves and the protection of the reef and think about what else we might be able to do. So we convened a summit. We brought together 70 national and international experts across fields of marine park management, fisheries management, fishers, tourism operators, traditional owners, conservationists, scientists. And I have to confess, I went into that thinking this is going to be pretty confronting because I don't think there is much more we can do. And I was concerned that the mood in the room would be quite sort of resigned to a poor future, but I was wrong. The mood in the room was pretty determined, and some of you in this audience were at that event. And the sentence that sums up the mood in the room was, together we can secure the future of the Great Barrier Reef, but we need to try harder, do more, and act now. And that translated into 10 specific initiatives, which are in that wheel on the right. I'm not going to go through every one of them, but importantly, several of those are going to be showcased here at this conference. So building a resilience network, we'll have at least a couple of presentations on Wednesday. There's a session on crown of thorns starfish tomorrow. Richard Quincy from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority will be talking about our field management program, including compliance. And of course, really an important part, or the main part of this whole conference, is about facilitating restoration. And as I said, as marine park managers, it's not necessarily that we are looking to what restoration tool do we want to employ tomorrow, but we need to begin the R&D and the partnerships between science, industry, traditional owners, and reef managers now in order to have tools in 10 or 20 years' time that we can actually use. At about the same time that we convened the Reef Summit and developed the Reef Blueprint, the Australian Institute of Marine Science formed a partnership, and the partners are there in the logos at the bottom of the screen. The partnership is called the Reef Restoration and Adaptation Program, and that partnership has three core foci: protecting the key functions and values of the reef, being logistically feasible to deploy at scale, and being at a price point that is affordable to deploy across entire reefscapes. Many of the talks from Australian scientists at this conference will be from scientists who are part of that collaboration, and later today David Mead will give an overview of that partnership, so I'm not going to go into any more detail. But suffice to say, this is a management, industry, science partnership, not to do a series of small disconnected restoration projects, but to develop a broad, multidisciplinary, multi-institutional, integrated approach to really find out what are the best possible restoration options for something at the scale of the Great Barrier Reef. And again, this has been mentioned before, but I might just go into a little bit more detail. So in April, there was the single biggest ever funding announcement by the federal government for the Great Barrier Reef. For the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, it means a substantial increase in our ability to undertake on-ground and on-water field management in the marine park. Really importantly, it's not just the 43 million over 6 years, although that's great. It's the 10 million per year ongoing. In other words, we know that we can expand and improve our program and that we will have that funding sustainably. And that is critical to our being better able to make the marine park and the zoning plan implemented out on the water. Russell spoke a little about our existing partnership with the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, and obviously that partnership is now growing because they've got 5 very important sub-programs that they are going to be running over the next 6 years. And critical to this conversation here are both the crown of thorn starfish control of 58 million over 6 years and the implementation and operational funding for the reef restoration and adaptation program, which is 100 million over 6 years. So this conversation for us Australian scientists, reef managers, is not just a theoretical one. This is a conversation about what will we be doing over the next 6 years with this money. Now, don't anybody start throwing things at me. This is not an actual risk assessment. I don't want anyone to see their pet project up there and go, that's outrageous, he can't say that. This is just a concept. Please don't be offended by where I have put things. I can already see one scientist raising their eyebrows at me. My point is this. Over the next 10 years, as we do this research and we consider how and where and when to use these interventions, we have to bear in mind that while our intention is good and we are looking to deliver positive outcomes for the reef, some of the interventions that we will be looking at have risks of negative outcomes as well. As a reef manager, I would always like to play it safe and stay in the top left corner. We can't play it safe anymore. Climate change is taking that luxury away from us. It already has taken that luxury away from us. But as reef managers, we have to ask, together with partners, stakeholders, scientists, where will we draw that line? Where will we say that we're willing to take a certain risk of a positive outcome despite the risk of a negative? This is where there is a dual role for the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority. We are trying to facilitate intervention and restoration in the park to improve its resilience, but that does not change the fact that we are still the regulators of the park and the people who are responsible for implementing the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Act. So it's almost schizophrenic to be trying to facilitate something but regulate something. I think so far we're doing a pretty good job, but that needs to be an ongoing conversation, and it's not just between the scientists and the managers. There are many things we need to consider, and most of these things are going to be the subjects of specific talks at different times during the conversation over the next 3 days. The top one is probably the most important one for me. A lot of the detractors of any form of intervention or restoration will argue that it is simply a distraction from the need to mitigate climate change. And my call to you is don't let it become a distraction. If you are talking to your family or your friends or stakeholders or people at a conference or the media, by all means, promote the work that you are doing in the restoration space. But don't ever let people forget the need for mitigation, because we're not going to produce a restoration option that is some magical silver bullet that will protect coral reefs at +2.5, +3 degrees. We're going to have to deal with the it's difficult to make things worse scenario. As impacts to reefs grow, there will be growing call for strong interventions, and I get back to my call for robust, rigorous risk assessment of the relative pros and cons of different strategies. One of the biggest challenges we have is that we need to define the objectives of the restoration. I think we would all agree we're not trying to restore reefs or the Great Barrier Reef to what it was, say, in 1981 when it was declared as a World Heritage Area. So what mix of ecosystem function, biodiversity, social, economic, cultural values are we trying to restore when we have an objective of restoration? A great topic for this conversation is the biophysical feasibility of what we're doing at different scales. Some of the techniques we're going to talk about may be marvelous for site management, but completely impractical for the management of an ecosystem the size of Italy. And I personally think we need to try and adopt a less is more philosophy. We should be willing to develop restoration tools that in the end we decide not to use, because we should be trying to intervene and restore as little as possible to maintain the functioning of the ecosystem. And then, of course, there are a whole bunch of social, economic, human dimensions to this subject, and I'm delighted to see such a strong focus in the speaker list and the sessions on these aspects of intervention and restoration. One of the most important is blending traditional ecological knowledge with Western science to make a way forward in terms of restoration. But these projects will raise questions around governance, as I spoke before about regulation versus facilitation. What does the broader society think about these issues in terms of the social license to operate? And we also need to think about funding. The $106 million that have already been put on the table by the Australian government are a great start to developing the R&D for what are the tools that will work. But if we find tools that will work, we will also need funds to implement them as part of ongoing marine park management. So I'm going to wrap up now, and I just want to remind you that everything we're discussing here sits in a context. And I think of it much as a pyramid. What we're talking about here, crown of thorn starfish control, restoration, sit at the pinnacle of the pyramid. But if you don't get the foundations right, the pyramid's not going to work. The foundation of this pyramid is strong mitigation. It is delivering on the objectives of the Paris Agreement, and it really does mean well below 2 degrees C. If at all possible, it means 1.5. The things that we have been doing for 30, 40, 50 years to protect coral reefs are still critically important. In fact, they are more important than they have ever been. And we need to continuously find ways to do the best job we possibly can. And then the subject of this conversation at this conference sits at the pinnacle of the pyramid. How do we develop new tools to expand the toolbox that we have to build a brighter future for the world's coral reefs? So I thank you for coming here. I think this is really important work. I think it's important we begin it now so that we are ready for what climate change is bringing. And I hope we'll have a great conference. Thank you.